Werner Altnickel has been self-employed master television technician since 1974. He has been awarded with the Euro Solar Prize in 1997 and other environmental awards. Altnickel has dealt intensively with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster of April 26, 1986. Today, KLA-TV is broadcasting a documentary by Werner Altnickel. In this, he demonstrates with evidence that the Chernobyl accident cannot have been an accident. This documentary is not just about a historical reappraisal. The weapon systems used back then pose an even more dangerous threat to us in the current dramatic global situation.
Significant statements by Professor Edmund Langfelder.
In his research, Werner Altnickel came across an article by Martin Ebner from August 31, 2003 about an excursion to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exclusion zone with journalists alongside Professor Dr. Edmund Langfelder from the Otto Hooch Radiation Institute in Munich. We quote from the report Countryside Excursion with Geiger Counter.
And what are these huge antennas that are not known from any Chernobyl photo, but can now be seen with the naked eye over Pripyat? Langfelder's explanation: this would be the unfinished answer to the USA Star Wars program, namely two 150-meter high and 600-meter long antenna walls. 10 of these had been supposed to be set up in a circle with a diameter of 35 kilometers in order to send high-frequency beams into the ionosphere. The nuclear power plant of Chernobyl was supposed to provide huge amounts of energy for it. 16 reactor units had been planned for this. That would have worked, Langfelder is certain. Chernobyl therefore did not only supply plutonium for nuclear bombs, but was itself part of a gigantic weapon.
Development of a military superweapon in the Soviet Union.
This new Russian technology became known as the woodpecker. The term originated from the radio interference noise similar to the hammering of a woodpecker, first discovered by amateur radio operators.
As a result of research into this military scalar superweapon, a major catastrophe occurred in the former USSR in 1957. At Kyshtym, near Mayak, there was a secret nuclear military research facility. This disaster resulted in regional radiation levels 100 times higher than in Chernobyl.
Former U.S. military Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden was an analyst at the Pentagon. He was an acknowledged scalar technology specialist and published the book Skalartechnologie in German language. He explains this disaster as follows.
The Soviets, after an early Kyshtym transmitter failure, had produced such a flashover, and that flashover had caused the nuclear explosion of nearby stored nuclear wastes. The resulting radioactive fallout contaminated some 1,200 square kilometers, which is still contaminated to this day. I also knew that after Kyshtym, the Soviets had installed safety devices on all their scalar interferometer transmitters in case of just such failures. So if the safety devices held when the transmitter suddenly shorted out, they could hold the longitudinal EM wave beams and potentials long enough to drain the energy slowly and harmlessly into the Earth over an extended period.
In his book Fer de Lance, Bearden continues to explain,
the new superweapons were developed, produced and deployed under the direction of the KGB. Since they were top secret, they were never handed over to the regular Russian army.
The former Soviet Union head of government Nikita Khrushchev made the following statement on future scalar weapons before the Soviet Presidium in 1960.
We have a new weapon, just within the portfolio of our scientists, so to speak, so powerful that if unrestrainedly used, it could wipe out all life on Earth.
Military superweapon can manipulate the weather.
Back in 1962, former U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson said, "He who controls the weather will control the world." The European Parliament also confirms the existence of such dangerous weather weapons in a report from January 14, 1999 called HARP, a climate-damaging weapons system.
Arms control attempts on the military superweapon.
In 1976-77, the UN ENMOD Convention could prevent environmental weapon systems. Here's an excerpt from the ENMOD Convention, Annex 2.
As examples, the understandings also include a non-exhaustive list of phenomena that could result from the use of environmental modification techniques: earthquakes and tsunamis, an upset in the ecological balance of a region, changes in weather patterns, clouds, precipitation, cyclones and tornadic storms, changes in climate patterns, changes in ocean currents, changes in the state of the ozone layer, and changes in the state of the ionosphere.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Dr. William Cohen confirmed the existence of these weapons of mass destruction on April 28, 1997, at a conference in Athens.
Other terrorists are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism, whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes, remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. It's real, and that's the reason why we have to intensify our counter-terrorism efforts.
The top secret prehistory of the Chernobyl reactor disaster.
Lieutenant Colonel Bearden wrote in his book Fedalance, which was published in a second edition in 2002, that he had been directly involved in the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl at the same time. In his book, he describes in great detail from a U.S. military perspective how scalar electromagnetic war technology caused this catastrophe. Here we quote excerpts from his book from page 129 onwards.
In April 1986, the KGB interferometers had started their buildup of substantial induced electromagnetic energy in the sides of the San Andreas Fault that runs through Los Angeles and up through San Francisco, using the inside of the woodpecker beams as superhighways for their longitudinal waves and interferometry. Two beams were being used by the Soviets. One was coming down on the target from the north, coming over the North Pole regions and the ice caps, and one was coming around from the east and upon the target area. The Soviets were building up a very large earthquake, indeed to spawn a whole series of such quakes all along the San Andreas Fault, with severe aftershocks following after the main quake had done terrible damage. In short, they were preparing to hit California with the big one that everyone had been anticipating and dreading for so long.
The U.S. response to the Soviet woodpecker attack.
We quote further from Tom Bearden's book.
A private group contacted me. They stated they could take out one of the transmitters by producing a powerful, giant phase conjugate replica signal pulse upon it that would backtrack right into the transmitter and catastrophically burn it out. In fact, it appeared that the entire Andreas Fault zone would be stimulated by deposit of excess energy all along its length. In that case, induction of a distributed California quake of unprecedented extent and great magnitude was now in process, though just beginning. If that event or those events occurred, the loss of American lives and property would be staggering.
The high side risk factor.
The group's query to me presented a very difficult decision situation. Such huge Soviet interferometer beams, once built up, contain enormous longitudinal electromagnetic wave energy. If a Soviet transmitter were near large nuclear facilities and were instantly blown and shorted, all the potential energy might flash directly into the ground. In case of such a catastrophic transmitter failure, an enormously powerful longitudinal wave impulse would spread out in all directions in the surrounding Earth. The first nuclear material the pulse encountered would be fissioned abruptly and very violently. If the transmitter were within a few kilometers of one or more of the large monster Soviet ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile sites, the full-up explosion of several 30 or 40 megaton warheads might result in the dirt and dirty. The resulting fallout and contamination would be massive, would spread round the world and would eventually kill millions for years to come. Nuclear reactor situations were a similar risk. Instant fission of all the fissionable material in one of them would constitute an unprecedented and giant nuclear explosion. In the dirt and dirty. That was the high side risk.
The low side risk factor.
I knew that the Soviets, after an early Kishtim transmitter failure, had produced such a flashover on a much smaller scale, and that flashover had caused the nuclear explosion of nearby stored nuclear wastes. I also knew that, after Kishtim, the Soviets had installed safety devices on all their scalar interferometer transmitters in case of just such failures. So if the safety devices held when the transmitter suddenly shorted out, they could hold the longitudinal electromagnetic wave beams and potentials long enough to drain the energy slowly and harmlessly into the Earth over an extended period. That was the low side risk.
The true cause of the Chernobyl disaster.
In his book, Bearden describes in detail how the reactor catastrophe was actually triggered.
The group thanked me, stated that they would fire, and hung up the phone. They did fire on April 25, 1986, just as they promised, and they did destroy one of the KGB transmitters, apparently located some kilometers from the Soviet nuclear reactors at Chernobyl. At the destroyed transmitter site, the safety circuits kicked in and caught the huge beam potential and held it for about 24 hours, gradually draining down the intense beam energy into the Earth in a slow manner all the while. Then, on 26th of April 1986, the safety circuits at the transmitter site finally crumbled, and a far weaker longitudinal wave flashover occurred than would have occurred earlier without the safety. The spreading longitudinal waves in the Earth struck the nearest reactor core at Chernobyl, preceded seconds before by a tremor induced in the Earth at Chernobyl as the longitudinal waves arrived. Part of the struck uranium in the core fissioned immediately, venting the containment structure and spewing out radioactive material. Nuclear fallout spread over much of Europe.
Russian scientists refute the official Chernobyl historiography.
Even after more than 38 years, the so-called leading media have made hardly any contribution to establishing the truth about the Chernobyl disaster. Out of necessity, however, even the so-called leading media occasionally reveal partial truths. One such example is the German NDR Arte documentary from 1998 entitled "The Real Reason for Chernobyl." As this documentary shows valuable original footage of the ruins in Chernobyl, which can make an important contribution to establishing the truth, we are now showing excerpts from this documentary. The inserted research background information by Werner Altnickel explains the actual events in Chernobyl very plausibly.
In July 1986, 2 months after the terrible disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the KGB issued a list of top-secret instructions. At the top of the list was, the actual cause of this accident, exceeding prediction, must never be known. But one man still wanted to find out the truth: the nuclear physicist Konstantin Pavlovich Checherov. That's why he kept climbing into the ruins, even under the sarcophagus that now surrounds the destroyed reactor number 4. He found strange traces of the accident that did not match the statements that had been made to the world public at the time.
Wir sind in den Reaktorschacht geklettert.
We climbed into the reactor shaft and crawled further into the respective control room above the reactor, even into the rooms below the reactor. We took photos and videos, took hundreds of samples, and I would say thousands of measurements. Only then did we slowly realize what had actually happened to Block 4. And suddenly we realized that the official statements from 1986 didn't match up at all with what we saw in front of us.
At the same time, in July 1986, the KGB handed senior politicians and officials a secret list with clear instructions.
This list was really created in a strange way, quite simply by the Secret Service, by the KGB. That was unusual, a political decision. The list was published and all political and scientific leaders had to adhere to it. Item 1 of the list: all information revealing the true causes of the reactor disasters is top secret. So all the official announcements were untrue because they weren't secret. Very strange.
The Chernobyl nuclear power plant was built in an area that is known to be geologically stable.
The opponents of the earthquake version claimed that there could be no earthquakes here because earthquakes simply do not occur in such an old geological plate structure as in this area.
The seismological station actually only registered a weak localized quake. 1990. A document from Kiev contains 20 eyewitness reports from power plant employees who were on duty that night. They said the earth shook before the catastrophe broke loose.
The magnitude 2 earthquake, which was verified by seismologists and confirmed by numerous eyewitnesses, occurred just a few seconds before the disaster. The NDR Arte documentary does not provide a sufficient answer to this earthquake. However, Lieutenant Colonel Bearden's comments now provide a conclusive explanation. Due to the geological conditions, it could not have been a natural earthquake, but was caused by the use of the described electromagnetic secret weapons. It was triggered at the moment when the safety precautions failed and the huge amounts of residual energy were discharged suddenly and uncontrollably into the earth. Only seconds later, an explosion occurred in the nuclear power plant. The impression given by the Arte documentary that the earthquake could be the cause of the disaster has proven to be false. German scientists have provided scientific proof in the Biblis-B nuclear power plant study that it takes at least approximately 30 minutes for a nuclear uranium core meltdown to occur. This is why the Arte documentary can ultimately only be explained by Tom Bearden's explanations that the Chernobyl nuclear disaster was caused by a warlike scalar electromagnetic exchange of blows between the KGB of the Soviet Union and the USA.
But these interesting statements were never given any attention.
I heard thunder. A plate fell from the ceiling. The floor shook, the lights went out, the emergency lighting came on. Through the hole in the roof, I could see kind of a glimmer, not fire, something else. The walls in the control room began to shake, as did the ceiling and the floor. After a few seconds, a second explosion, a little weaker. I saw in the strange light how everything flew apart, a colorful shimmer that shot upwards to a height of 100 meters.
The eyewitness reports and Checherov's findings make one thing clear. The statement published by the Soviet authorities in 1986 was false. Again and again, completely surprising observations are made.
There had been hope that the graphite shell and the reactor core had remained intact, but none of that was the case. There was just a gaping hole. It had been assumed that the ring-shaped bioprotective container around the reactor had been destroyed, or at least severely damaged. But this was also wrong. It was almost intact, with only minor damage. On a large part of its surface, especially on the inside, even the paint had been preserved.
See also Bearden report statements. It all happened in a matter of seconds, when the EMP energy input suddenly activated the uranium and threw it out. A normal meltdown would have been much slower, and the paint in the container would certainly have burned off. It happened so quickly that the thermal inertia of the biocontainer probably prevented the paint from burning, even on the inside.
It was expected that an explosion in the reactor shaft would tear everything open, but nothing was torn open. Many of the supports for stabilizing the graphite cap had simply melted off and burned. And when you took a closer look at these melted parts, it became very clear that a very peculiar heat effect had been at work here. Like from a welding torch that had burned through the pipes. Yes, the pipes look as if they have been cut off by a welding machine or a plasma torch.
The pipes, which were destroyed as if by a plasma torch, can only be conclusively explained by the plasma created by the enormous scalar electromagnetic energy, which was no longer intercepted by the failed safety grounding systems.
The earthquake begins. A big crash and Block 4 trembles. 1 a.m., 23 minutes and 40 seconds. The employee in charge notices the tremor and presses the emergency switch. The vibrations increase. The first powerful impact, vertical supports lurch back and forth. Ceiling tiles fall down. The glimmer of light again. Windows burst in the machine hall. A violent earth tremor, and the reactor explodes.
But there's a stumbling block. According to Checherov's version, the situation in the reactor should escalate in 15 to 20 seconds to the point where an explosion occurs. Block 4 offers the following picture. The molten metal flowed across the floor, hit an obstacle, shot up and solidified in the shape of a bunch of grapes. You can still see it today, and of course we filmed it. It can be estimated that the molten metal flowed at a speed of about 5 meters per second. So not slow or viscous. 5 meters per second, that's very fast. The molten metal has traveled a maximum of 50 meters from the reactor. So the metal flowed for about 10 seconds, then it solidified. And often in a vertical position, that is while it was flowing down. So there wasn't even enough time to flow to the ground and freeze there. In addition, there's the fact that people were climbing around in the destroyed reactor. Of course, you thought that the radiation intensity there must be enormous because the radioactive material from the reactor had flowed there. Now it turned out that the radiation there is actually not that strong. Of course, the people had put on protective suits for the expedition into the reactor ruins. But it is still very surprising that none of them died. Apparently not even anyone became seriously ill. That is interesting. Apparently hardly any of the radioactive material from the reactor found its way into the building, not even in free fall downwards. It all happened far too quickly.
Note: the rapid and short-lived flow movement described before, and the sudden solidification of the melt makes sense if one recognizes that the external EMP energy input into the uranium was violent and only lasted for a few seconds. This means violent and rapid activation of the uranium atomic nuclei and hot, thin molten mass with a fast flow rate and rapid solidification in the middle of the flow, when the induced EMP energy breaks off and thus the externally ignited electromagnetic fire disappears. According to the official KGB lists, only 4% of the reactor filling has allegedly escaped, and 96% would still be in the ruins. In fact, it is probably the other way around. Almost everything flew out, and the reactor is almost empty. Scientists also confirm this. The escaped, briefly very hot melt below the reactor vessel must have consisted mainly of the cladding metal, for example zirconium for the uranium. The uranium, activated by external energy input, suddenly shot upwards into the open air as if from a cannon barrel. Because hardly any activated uranium escaped below and hardly any radiation was measurable, people were able to climb in without dying. When the Soviets realized that their facility was being shot at by the Americans, they still managed to divert the energy, which was then thrown back into the Earth for 24 hours. But after 24 hours, these earthing systems with storage facilities failed to be able to contain these enormous energies at all. And when you consider that only the rest that remained, even though they had already discharged for 24 hours, managed to blow up a nuclear power plant, you can imagine what would have happened if, for example, they hadn't had such a containment system, that is, a discharge system into the ground for full energies, which then comes back. Then they would have all blown up.
The significance of the Chernobyl revelation with regard to the current dramatic world situation.
The scalar superweapons described have been further developed by the military and secret services since the heavy accident in Chernobyl almost 40 years ago and are certainly even more dangerous today. This Chernobyl revelation therefore raises many serious questions, particularly with regards to the current very dramatic world situation.
First, are the current climate changes and weather phenomena such as extreme drought, floods, tornadoes, and even earthquakes, etc., as also confirmed in the UN NMOD Convention, directly related to these secret military superweapon systems? Second, is the current CO2 scaremongering just a globally organized diversionary tactic so that these weather weapon systems can continue to be used unnoticed by the public? Third, are nuclear power plants a ticking time bomb because they can be attacked by these secret weapon systems at any time? Fourth, do these secret weapons technologies pose a much greater threat than nuclear weapons in view of an escalation of the current trouble spots in the world?
Dear viewers, the time of investigative education through truth-loving people has come. Please help to ensure that this documentary will become known in all ways possible. Share this awakening video on social platforms such as Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Telegram, Instagram, or by email. We also provide you with short excerpts of the programs on our social media platforms. Only through your active sharing of these facts, criminals who are still deploying these weapons in secret and undetected from the public can be stopped.